There are monuments in this world that still defy explanation. Ancient pyramids, larger than mountains of stone, mysteries carved into the Sphinx's face, and chambers hidden deep inside the desert. These aren't legends or myths. They're real puzzles historians still can't fully solve. How were these massive stones lifted into place? Why do their alignments point so perfectly to the stars? And what secrets are still sealed inside, waiting to be found? From tunnels that lead nowhere to blocks set with impossible precision, tonight we'll explore 101 mysteries about ancient Egypt that historians can't explain. So sit back, relax, and take a slow breath, because before we chase the great unknowns, we have to face the strangest part of all, the few things we actually know for sure, and why even those raise more questions. When you step into the question of Egypt's pyramids, the first thing to hold on to is that not everything is mystery. Some things are, in fact, firm ground beneath your feet, and these act as the baseline from which every unresolved question springs. Without that foundation, you would only be chasing shadows. Historians agree that the plateau at Giza belongs firmly to Egypt's Old Kingdom, more precisely the 4th dynasty, around 2600 to 2500 BCE. That temporal frame is not speculation. It emerges from king lists, inscriptions, and radiocarbon samples tied to this dynasty's reigns. So before you consider gaps, you anchor yourself in this epoch, the height of centralized royal power, when the pharaoh's authority was immense and resources could be mobilized on a continental scale. The first secure point is that the great monuments at Giza are attributed to 3 rulers: Khufu, whom later Greek authors called Cheops; Khafre, the builder associated with the second pyramid, and perhaps the Great Sphinx; and Menkaure, whose pyramid is smaller but still monumental. Their names are not guesses. They appear on statues, in tomb inscriptions, and in quarry marks. Archaeologists emphasize that this is not a fringe assumption. It is as close to historical bedrock as one can get in antiquity. Khufu's name, for example, is painted in red ochre in workman's graffiti, found in the relieving chambers above the so-called King's Chamber, an inscription placed by the construction gangs themselves. The second fact you must absorb is that these pyramids were never isolated stone mountains in the desert. Each was the centerpiece of a vast funerary complex that integrated multiple elements: a mortuary temple attached to the pyramid, a causeway leading down to a valley temple at the Nile's edge, subsidiary pyramids for queens, mastaba fields for officials, and storage magazines. When you view Giza only as 3 solitary pyramids, you miss the systemic nature of Old Kingdom funerary design. Archaeologists stress that this integration reflects not just architectural ambition, but also a worldview in which the pharaoh's afterlife was enmeshed with solar cults, ancestor veneration, and administrative machinery. The third piece of solid ground is the sheer scale and precision of the measurements. Surveyors have confirmed that the base of Khufu's pyramid is nearly square, with sides differing by only a few centimeters across more than 200 meters, and that its orientation to true north is astonishingly accurate. The deviation is a matter of minutes of arc, better than many modern constructions before the age of GPS. This is not mystical exaggeration. It is the result of direct geodetic surveys published in the 20th and 21st centuries. Scholars point out that such accuracy implies systematic methods of astronomical alignment, not chance. Even skeptics of mystery narratives concede that the precision is real and must be explained by practical techniques. A fourth and often overlooked certainty is that Giza's necropolis was active and used by the elite. Hundreds of mastabas surround the pyramids, filled with burials, stelae, and inscriptions that record the lives of officials. These are not gaps in the record. They are an overwhelming chorus of voices confirming that the plateau was the locus of royal power and funerary cult. The bureaucratic machine that raised the pyramids also sustained generations of tomb builders, priests, and administrators. Inscriptions on mastabas detail titles, offices, and roles within the pyramid cults, showing that these structures were integrated into Egypt's social and religious fabric for centuries. Yet, even as you note these secure anchors, you start to sense the first cracks of uncertainty. The reigns are dated, the patrons are named, the complexes are mapped, and the orientation is measurable, but none of these things explain how the stones were raised or why the internal design takes the form it does. The paradox is sharp. On one hand, so much is documented and beyond serious doubt. On the other, the very heart of the construction process remains hidden. This is why historians insist on beginning with the certainties. If you leap only to the unexplained, you risk losing sight of the scaffolding of evidence that has survived. It is worth pausing here to underline why these four certainties matter. They form the reference points for every debate that follows. If you hear a claim that places the pyramids in a different millennium or assigns them to a civilization outside Egypt, it must be measured against the fact that Old Kingdom officials were buried in their shadow, that hieroglyphic inscriptions name the kings directly, and that the broader funerary complexes are tied into the Nile's floodplain by causeways and temples. The orientation is not only an engineering marvel, it is also a chronological marker, because the stellar methods available in the 4th dynasty provide a plausible mechanism for such precision. Still, the certainties do not erase the allure of the unknown. You are left with a contradiction. The more firmly you grasp the solid evidence, the more baffling it becomes that the essential instructions, the architectural manuals, or detailed building records are absent. That absence will drive the narrative forward, because it is in the silence of the ancient record that mystery takes root. And this is where the transition to the next stage becomes inevitable. If you know who the kings were and when they reigned, the next question is not whether pyramids were built under their authority, but how tens of thousands of tons of stone were actually moved, lifted, and placed with such consistency. The evidence does not stop at the foot of the pyramid. It extends into the settlements where the workers lived, the rations they consumed, and the organization that sustained them. That is the next layer you must explore, because without understanding the labor system, the pyramid is only an empty outline. Once the foundations of chronology and attribution are clear, the question shifts toward people. Stones do not move themselves. Precision is not achieved without hands, eyes, and organization. What historians emphasize is that Giza was not the work of an anonymous horde or of slaves driven by whips, as later myths suggested. Instead, the evidence points to a workforce structured, provisioned, and sustained in ways that reveal as much about Egyptian society as about the pyramids themselves. Archaeologists unearthed a settlement south of the plateau at a site known today as Hayt el-Ghurab. The ruins preserve traces of bakeries, granaries, and barracks-like housing. This was not a random village, but a planned camp for labourers, supervisors, and support staff. Excavations revealed huge quantities of cattle bones, particularly prime cuts, suggesting a diet designed to fuel heavy labour. Bread and beer formed the daily staples, but the presence of beef and other rich proteins underlines that these were not expendable slaves, but valued workers in a state-directed project. The organization here speaks volumes. To feed and house thousands of people required logistics on a scale that mirrored the pyramid's size itself. From this settlement and related finds, researchers estimate the workforce in the tens of thousands. Numbers vary because the evidence allows multiple models, perhaps 20,000 labourers in peak phases, or up to 30,000 if auxiliary support crews are counted. What unites the estimates is the recognition that the older picture of hundreds of thousands of chained slaves is unsustainable. Greek historians such as Herodotus offered exaggerated figures, but archaeology points to a much more practical system, rotating crews of conscripted farmers, called up during the Nile's flood season when fields were underwater and agricultural work paused. These crews were likely supplemented by permanent specialists, masons, toolmakers, surveyors, and priests. The combination created a flexible labour pool, sufficient to move and place the stones while keeping the rural economy intact. Documents and ostraca, limestone flakes used as writing surfaces, add further texture. They record rations of bread and beer distributed to workers. One text lists 10 loaves and 2 jugs of beer per man per day, amounts that underline the caloric needs of physical labour. Such details ground the labour system in daily life. You can imagine the long lines, the issuing of bread from large communal ovens, the transport of beer in ceramic jars sealed with clay stoppers. These provisions were not symbolic, but logistical necessities that kept bodies strong and morale steady. What is especially striking are the names preserved in graffiti left inside the pyramids themselves. In the hidden chambers, above the king's chamber, in Khufu's pyramid, construction crews daubed their team names in red paint. These names include phrases like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure, a mixture of loyalty and humour that humanizes the workforce. Such inscriptions remind you that behind the immensity of stone were men with identities, pride, and camaraderie. They also anchor the attribution of the monuments. These are direct, contemporary marks that tie the construction to the reign of Khufu, not to a lost civilization. A final element in this block connects the workforce to the Nile's cycle. The inundation that occurred annually between July and October was both obstacle and opportunity. Flooded fields meant farmers could be redirected to state projects without undermining food production. At the same time, the swollen river allowed stone to be floated closer to the plateau. Evidence suggests that provisioning and construction activity peaked in these months, when labour availability and transport capacity converged. Historians argue that this seasonal rhythm underpinned the pyramid's progress. When the river fell and farming resumed, many workers returned to their fields, leaving a smaller core of specialists to continue tasks that required continuity. Together, these threads, settlements, diet, workforce estimates, ration texts, graffiti, and seasonal cycles form a coherent picture. The pyramids were the outcome not of supernatural powers or faceless masses, but of a carefully managed social machine. Each stone raised was part of a broader choreography of logistics, calendar, and human effort. And yet, for all that this picture clarifies, it also raises a sharper question. Even if you can see how people were gathered, fed, and organized, the puzzle remains. How were the stones actually transported and lifted into place? The camps explain who, the rations explain how they survived, the graffiti explain why they endured, but none of this tells you how a block of granite from Aswan made its way up the pyramid's flank. That is why the narrative must now move from the people themselves to the pathways of the stones. The organization of labor sets the stage for the engineering mystery. Workers cannot build without material. Supply lines and transport techniques are the next frontier of evidence. And when you follow the trail of the blocks, you arrive at canyons, river ports, and ramps, whose remains still whisper of journeys carved in stone. If labor camps show you the human side of the enterprise, quarries and transport routes reveal the raw mechanics of the supply chain. A pyramid is not conjured from sand. It is assembled block by block, and those blocks had to come from somewhere. The very bedrock of the Giza Plateau provided a large portion of the material, but not all. Excavations reveal massive quarries immediately adjacent to the pyramids, scars in the limestone plateau where blocks were hacked out, trimmed, and hauled only a short distance to the construction site. The geological match between the core blocks of Khufu's pyramid and the local strata is exact, a clear case of builders using what lay under their feet. But this ready supply was not enough for the finer elements of construction. Archaeologists found that the gleaming white casing stones, long since stripped away, came from Tura, a quarry east of the Nile. Their superior quality of limestone gave the pyramids a polished, radiant finish. To bring this stone across the river, ancient builders needed more than muscle. They needed an organized fleet and infrastructure. That's where one of the most remarkable discoveries enters the record. the so-called Diary of Mira, written on papyrus and found at Wadi el-Jaf on the Red Sea coast. The diary is the logbook of a middle-ranking official named Mera. In meticulous entries, he describes transporting stone from Tura to Akhet Khufu, the ancient name for Khufu's pyramid complex. He notes the loading of blocks onto boats, the movement along canals, and the delivery to Giza. The papyrus dates squarely to Khufu's reign, making it the earliest surviving document of its kind. For historians, it is a treasure because it anchors the supply chain in real time. Mera's words confirm that blocks were shipped via Nile tributaries and offloaded at ports close to the plateau. Supporting this, archaeologists uncovered remains of harbour installations near Giza. Sediment cores suggest the Nile once ran closer to the pyramids than it does today, with a basin that allowed large shipments to dock nearby. Reconstructions envision fleets of wooden boats, each carrying multiple blocks, guided along canals that were engineered specifically for pyramid construction. In this sense, the Nile was not merely a symbolic lifeline for Egypt, but the literal artery through which the pyramids were fed. Once ashore, the challenge shifted from floating to dragging. Reliefs from other sites, along with experiments by modern engineers, show the use of wooden sledges. These sledges carried stone across prepared tracks of sand. For a long time, scholars assumed this required immense manpower, but an overlooked detail in a Middle Kingdom tomb painting changed the picture. The scene shows a man pouring water in front of a sledge. Physicists tested this detail and found that dampened sand reduces friction dramatically, making heavy loads easier to drag. What looked like a minor ritual act in the painting turned out to be a practical insight. By controlling the moisture content of the sand, workers could halve the force required to move stone. The landscape itself still carries hints of the ramps and pathways used in this process. At the quarries around Giza, archaeologists uncovered carved tracks, post holes, and rough ramps that suggest how blocks were maneuvered upward. They may not answer the full question of how stones were raised to pyramid heights, but they show the intermediate steps from quarry face to construction site. Each groove in the rock, each slope, represents a trace of the logistics that enabled the pyramid to grow layer by layer. Together, these elements form a chain. Limestone cores cut directly from the plateau, fine casing stone ferried from Tura on boats described by Mira, granite blocks from Aswan floated hundreds of kilometers down the Nile, ports and canals drawing the river up to the base of the plateau, sledges pulled across dampened sand, ramps and tracks guiding the stones to the pyramid's base. It is a sequence historians can reconstruct with confidence, at least in its broad outlines. And yet the sequence falters when you look upward. Knowing how stone reached Giza is not the same as knowing how it was lifted to the higher tiers. Ramps explain part of the journey, but at what scale? Could they extend far enough, or were they dismantled in stages? The canyons and quarries give you the trailheads, but not the summit. So while the third layer of certainty shows how the pyramids were supplied, it also sets up the most enduring engineering riddle. Once the stones were at the plateau, how did builders raise them higher and higher until the pyramid was complete? That tension between clarity and obscurity carries you into the next section. From the quarries you learn where the stones came from. From the transport routes you learn how they reached the site. From sledges and ramps you learn how they touched the base. But the problem of elevation remains suspended above all this evidence, as if the stones climb only part way before vanishing into the unknown. It is there, in the missing mechanism of ascent, that the mystery sharpens again. By the time the blocks reached the plateau, another challenge loomed. Moving a stone from quarry to base is only the beginning, raising it tens of meters into the air, with layer after layer stacking until the summit is a problem of another order. This is where the evidence thins and hypotheses multiply. The paradox is sharp. We know how the stones arrived at Giza, but not with certainty how they rose. One line of thought imagines colossal ramps stretching outward from the pyramid's face. Archaeologists have found traces of ramps in nearby quarries, and fragments of ramp systems exist at other pyramid sites, such as the unfinished pyramid at Zoyat El Arian. But the scale needed for Khufu's pyramid staggers the imagination. To reach 146 meters at a gentle incline, a straight ramp would have had to extend 4 kilometers and consume more material than the pyramid itself. Such an idea is difficult to reconcile with the absence of massive ramp debris at Giza. This leads many scholars to regard the notion of a single colossal ramp as an incomplete explanation rather than a final answer. In response, other researchers propose ramps that turned and twisted rather than stretching endlessly. Some envision zigzagging structures along the pyramid's faces, allowing blocks to ascend in a switchback pattern. Others imagine ramps wrapping helically around the pyramid, providing continuous access without requiring monumental lengths. These ideas solve certain logistical puzzles, but they face their own obstacles. No clear archaeological remains of such spirals or switchbacks survive at Giza, and reconstructions rely heavily on modelling rather than excavation. The debate reflects the tension between practical plausibility and material proof. A different school of thought shifts the emphasis from ramps to leverage. Engineers have suggested that blocks could have been lifted short distances by wooden levers, each increment raising the stone a few centimeters until it could be slid into place. This technique is known in other contexts of ancient construction and requires far less material than a massive ramp. Proponents argue that levers could explain the precision with which blocks were set in the upper courses, where room for a ramp would have been limited. Critics, however, point out that scaling this technique up to tens of thousands of blocks would require immense coordination and remains speculative without direct archaeological traces. The absence of definitive remains has led to hybrid models. Some scholars argue that no single method suffices to explain the construction. Instead, they propose a combination: large ramps for the lower tiers, reduced ramps or zigzags for the middle stages, and levers or scaffolding for the uppermost stones. In this blended view, the pyramid's rise was not uniform, but adaptive, with builders altering methods as they ascended. This explanation has the virtue of flexibility, but it also reflects how the debate itself is shaped, not by one closed solution, but by layered possibilities that resist collapse into a single narrative. What emerges from this discussion is not a definitive blueprint, but a spectrum of plausible methods, each supported by some evidence, yet contradicted by other gaps. Scholars point out that the lack of direct remains may be due to dismantling. Ramps and scaffolds could have been removed once their purpose was fulfilled, leaving little for archaeologists to find. Still, the silence of the archaeological record is striking, especially given the otherwise meticulous remains of quarries, workmen's villages, and transport infrastructure. And so you face a paradox. The stones stand as physical proof that a method existed, but the method itself remains elusive. You know they were raised. You can imagine how they might have been raised, but you cannot point to the ramp, lever, or spiral that did the work. The mystery is not whether the pyramid was built, but how the builders solved a problem that remains unsolved in our own minds. This uncertainty is not a failure of knowledge, but part of the fascination. Each theory, whether of ramps, spirals, or levers, opens questions about organization, engineering, and adaptation. Did the builders plan the method from the beginning, or did they innovate as they went? Was the system elegant and uniform, or messy and pragmatic? Such questions invite you deeper, because the problem of elevation is not merely technical. It is emblematic of the gap between what the stones prove and what the records omit. As you follow the mystery upward, the pyramid itself becomes a metaphor, a base of certainty, narrowing into a summit of speculation. And from that summit, the view shifts again, not to the exterior ascent, but to the hidden interiors, because even once the stones are in place, what lies inside them carries puzzles no less compelling than the mystery of how they were raised. When you step inside the Great Pyramid, the sense of mystery deepens. Outside, the challenge is visible, tons of stone stacked in geometric perfection. Inside, the puzzles are more subtle, because the architecture is precise, unusual, and filled with features whose purpose is debated even today. It is here that the paradox of certainty and enigma tightens, since the corridors, chambers, and hidden details survive in stone, yet the logic behind them remains partly veiled. At the lowest level, cut deep into the bedrock beneath the pyramid, lies a chamber often called the subterranean room. It is rough-hewn compared with the more finished spaces above, and no burial has ever been found within it. Its very incompleteness raises questions. Was it an abandoned first design, or did it serve a ritual function that remains unclear? Archaeologists recognize it as evidence of planning changes during construction, suggesting that the pyramid's design evolved even as it was being built. Above the bedrock chamber, the narrow descending passage intersects with an ascending passage that climbs steeply upward. This leads into the so-called Queen's Chamber, though no queen was ever buried there. Its walls are smooth, its roof corbelled, and from it extend two small shafts, angled upward toward the exterior. For centuries, these shafts were assumed to be ventilation ducts, but their narrowness and upward trajectory cast doubt on that interpretation. Modern probes revealed that they do not open to the outside at ground level, but terminate with small doors or blocking stones, complete with copper fittings. The function of these shafts is one of the pyramid's most enduring riddles. Some scholars suggest symbolic pathways for the soul of the king toward particular stars, while others see them as structural or ritual devices whose exact meaning is lost. The main ascent continues into the grand gallery, a soaring passage almost 9 meters high, lined with corbelled blocks that narrow as they rise. Its precision is extraordinary, and its scale seems out of proportion with any practical need. This gallery channels visitors toward the king's chamber, yet its steep incline and perfectly aligned joints suggest more than a simple corridor. Above it, a system of overlapping granite beams forms what are called relieving chambers, 5 levels of massive stones, stacked to divert weight away from the king's chamber below. In these spaces, graffiti left by the work crews mention Khufu by name, offering crucial evidence of royal patronage. But the engineering puzzle remains. Such an elaborate system for weight distribution seems both ingenious and excessive, leading some scholars to wonder whether more than structural necessity was at play. The king's chamber itself, built entirely from granite, hauled from Aswan hundreds of kilometers away, holds a single massive sarcophagus. Carved from a single block, it is larger than the chamber's entrance, meaning it must have been placed before the chamber was sealed. No body or funerary treasures were found within, leading to debates about whether it was looted in antiquity, or whether the pyramid was never used as a tomb in the conventional sense. What is beyond dispute is the technical mastery of its construction. The walls, ceiling beams, and floor slabs weigh tens of tons each, aligned with extraordinary accuracy. Even the layout hints at mid-course corrections. Scholars note that the pyramid's internal passages show signs of alteration, as if the original plan was modified during construction. The existence of the subterranean chamber, the Queen's Chamber, and the King's Chamber in a single monument suggests evolving intentions. Was the first chamber abandoned as impractical, the second reassigned as symbolic, and the third finalized as the true burial place? Or were all three part of a complex ritual landscape designed from the outset? Archaeological evidence supports both interpretations, but no definitive text settles the matter. The more you examine these interiors, the more you sense that the pyramid is not a monolithic design, but a palimpsest of intentions, practical needs, and religious concepts. The subterranean void may represent an early attempt, or a symbolic underworld. The Queen's Chamber may embody ritual rather than burial. The King's Chamber may reflect the ultimate fusion of engineering and theology. Yet the absence of explicit explanations means that every block is both proof and riddle. This is why the interior architecture is often described as the pyramid's second mystery, distinct from the question of construction techniques. The exterior raises the problem of how, the interior raises the problem of why. Both converge in the same monument, forcing you to see it not merely as a physical structure, but as a layered puzzle of human intent. And it is this layering that prepares you for the next turn in the investigation. For even when you map out the known chambers and passages, recent discoveries suggest that hidden voids remain undiscovered. The inside of the pyramid, like the methods that raised it, still holds surprises that push historians and engineers alike to reconsider what they thought they knew. The Great Pyramid does not give up its secrets easily. Even after centuries of exploration, careful measurement, and modern scanning, it continues to yield anomalies that challenge simple explanations. It is not only the massive scale or the enigmatic chambers that provoke questions, but the subtle irregularities, minute alignments, hidden voids, unexplained temperature readings that complicate the story. These are not inventions of fringe speculation, but documented by professional surveys, physicists, and archaeologists. Each anomaly is real, but what it means is another matter. Surveyors who measured the pyramid with 20th century instruments confirmed that its orientation to true north is astonishingly precise. The error margin is so small, mere minutes of arc, that it outperforms most other constructions of antiquity and rivals modern benchmarks before the age of satellites. This level of accuracy is not a vague claim, but a matter of recorded data. For historians, the precision is both a marvel and a puzzle. It demonstrates that Old Kingdom engineers possessed reliable methods of stellar or solar observation, but it also leaves open the question of why such meticulous care was considered necessary. Was this precision purely functional, a matter of symmetry and stability, or was it tied to symbolic aims such as aligning the king's resting place with cosmic order? The fact is measurable, the meaning remains contested. More recently, in 2015, an international team used infrared thermography to scan the pyramid's exterior. On the north face, they recorded unusual hotspots, areas where heat seemed to escape differently than from surrounding blocks. Such thermal anomalies suggest hidden voids or differences in material density. The data do not, by themselves, explain what lies behind the anomalies. They merely indicate that the pyramid's internal structure is more complex than the visible corridors and chambers suggest. Researchers debated whether these were construction gaps, unknown passageways, or geological effects, but none could deny the physical readings. For a monument studied so intensely, the possibility of undiscovered spaces was both thrilling and disquieting. That sense of disquiet deepened in 2017, when the Scan Pyramids project employed muon tomography, a technique adapted from particle physics. By tracking cosmic rays that penetrate stone, the team identified a massive void above the Grand Gallery. This big void, as they cautiously called it, is at least 30 meters long and has no known connection to existing chambers. The finding was published in a peer-reviewed journal, not as speculation, but as confirmed detection. Yet its purpose remains a blank. Some archaeologists proposed it might be a structural device to relieve pressure, echoing the granite relieving chambers above the king's chamber. Others noted that its size far exceeds what structural necessity alone might require. With no access to the void, only particle traces, its role is suspended between confirmation and mystery. Even smaller details add to the puzzle. Thermographic surveys revealed slight variations across different parts of the pyramid, suggesting that not all stones retain or release heat in the same way. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of construction phases with differing materials or techniques. Others point to potential microvoids or air pockets within the mass. These are subtle clues, not sensational claims, but they remind you that the pyramid is not a uniform monolith. It is a composite structure, layered with choices that are not yet fully understood. Taken together, these anomalies underline a paradox. On one hand, they show that the pyramid was built with a precision that still astonishes. True north orientation, carefully aligned galleries, and engineered weight-bearing systems. On the other hand, the anomalies reveal gaps, thermal hotspots, unexplained voids, density shifts that resist integration into a neat story. Historians must live with this tension. The pyramid is at once an object of extraordinary control and a structure whose hidden geometry continues to defy total mapping. The larger question becomes whether these anomalies represent intentional design or unintended byproducts. Did the builders create cavities and alignments for symbolic or ritual reasons, embedding meaning in the stone itself? Or are the voids merely pragmatic solutions, scaffolding traces, or architectural experiments frozen in time? The absence of inscriptions that describe the engineering choices means that modern science provides the data but not the answers. Each new scan sharpens the mystery rather than dissolves it. And this is why the Great Pyramid is often described as a monument that refuses to be exhausted by study. Every time technology advances, new measurements appear, and with them new uncertainties. Far from closing the case, modern tools keep the questions alive. The pyramid remains both known and unknown, its anomalies marking the boundary where evidence meets interpretation. This sense of incompleteness sets up the next thread in the investigation, for if the Great Pyramid itself resists full explanation, the wider Giza complex contains another enigma, carved not in blocks but in living rock, the Sphinx. Its body, its face, its erosion patterns, and its uncertain chronology open yet another frontier of debate, a different kind of puzzle, where stone speaks in riddles of age and identity. Just beyond the pyramids, the Sphinx crouches, half lion, half human, hewn from the bedrock itself. It is impossible to consider the mysteries of Giza without confronting this guardian figure, for it embodies both grandeur and ambiguity. Unlike the pyramids, which carry clear royal attributions through quarry marks and surrounding inscriptions, the Sphinx speaks in silence. Its very form, monumental, eroded, altered, raises as many questions as it answers. Archaeological consensus holds that the Sphinx was carved directly from the natural limestone outcrop on the plateau. The quarry scars around it suggest that the hollowed trench in which it sits doubled as a source of stone for the nearby pyramid complex. The builders transformed a geological feature into a symbolic colossus, leaving behind both statue and pit. Yet the geology complicates the picture. The Sphinx is carved from layered limestone, some strata harder, some softer, and the weathering has affected each differently. These natural variations gave the statue its uneven surface, and have also fueled debate over how long it has stood exposed. The face, once thought to bear the likeness of Khafre, shows evidence of recarving and repair. Nose and beard are long gone, fragments of the latter preserved in museums. In Pharaonic times, restoration projects sought to maintain the monument, plastering damaged surfaces and shoring up weak strata. Later interventions, Roman, medieval, and modern, added their own patches. The cumulative result is a face that has been reshaped multiple times, leaving scholars uncertain about how closely it resembles its original form. Was it intended to be Khafre himself, or a more generalized solar deity? The absence of definitive inscriptions naming the statue leaves the identification suspended. Debate intensifies when erosion is considered. Some geologists have argued that the weathering patterns on the body suggest significant water erosion, not merely wind and sand. They point to rounded profiles and vertical channels that, in their view, could only have been carved by heavy rainfall in a wetter climate. Since such conditions belong to a period earlier than the 4th dynasty, the implication would be that the Sphinx predates Khafre's reign by centuries, perhaps millennia. This claim is provocative, but not universally accepted. Egyptologists counter that the observed patterns can be explained by the softness of certain limestone layers and by the effects of fluctuating groundwater and salt crystallization. The debate remains open, with geology and archaeology speaking in different registers, each with its own evidence. Equally unresolved is the matter of the Sphinx's original patron. Mainstream scholarship still associates it with Khafre, largely because of its alignment with his pyramid and causeway, and because fragments of a statue of Khafre were found in the Sphinx temple nearby. Yet without an inscription that declares I, Khafre, made this, the attribution remains circumstantial. Alternative hypotheses have been raised that Khufu ordered it, or that it was recarved from an earlier, more primitive lion-form statue, but none can claim definitive proof. The very silence of the monument keeps all theories alive. Thus, the Sphinx presents a peculiar case. Its existence is undeniable, its scale overwhelming, its workmanship evident, but its date of origin, its intended identity, and even its original form are subjects of dispute. Unlike the pyramids, where workmen's graffiti tie stones to kings, the Sphinx is a solitary enigma. It sits at the edge of the desert, as if guarding not only the plateau, but also the unanswered questions of its own creation. This unresolved status is part of its enduring fascination. Tourists see a symbol, archaeologists see a riddle, geologists see an argument carved into stone. Every interpretation draws from the same weathered body, yet each produces a different conclusion. The Sphinx, more than the pyramids, dramatizes how evidence can be both abundant and inconclusive at the same time. And from this silent guardian, attention naturally shifts skyward. If the pyramids and Sphinx anchor themselves in the desert, their orientation points outward toward the stars. It is there, in the alignments of monuments with celestial markers, that another domain of mystery unfolds, an area where precision is clear, but intention remains contested. Looking at Giza from above, what strikes observers as much as the mass of stone is the accuracy of orientation. The pyramids are not scattered at random, but aligned with astonishing fidelity to the cardinal points. Surveyors using modern instruments have measured Khufu's pyramid at less than 4 minutes of arc off true north. This is a precision difficult to achieve even with contemporary tools, and for a structure more than 4,500 years old, it borders on the uncanny. The fact itself is beyond dispute. The question is how it was achieved and what it signified. One explanation places the builders under the night sky. Scholars propose that ancient Egyptian surveyors used pairs of circumpolar stars, watching as they crossed the meridian and setting out the pyramid's orientation in relation to their path. Simulations show that around the era of Khufu, particular star pairs could indeed have provided a north-south reference with minute accuracy. Such a method requires careful observation over time, but it fits the astronomical knowledge we know the Egyptians possessed. Yet even this plausible technique raises deeper questions. Why was such precision necessary in the first place? Other monumental cultures tolerated far greater deviations without concern. Into this gap enters another set of theories, ones that connect the pyramids not just to cardinal points, but to constellations. The most famous is the Orion correlation, which notes that the 3 pyramids of Giza appear to mirror the 3 stars of Orion's belt. Advocates argue that the alignment was intentional, tying the king's tombs to Osiris, the god of rebirth, who was associated with Orion. Egyptologists, however, are divided. Critics point out that the scale and orientation of the pyramids do not match the stars perfectly, and that textual evidence for such a correlation is lacking in the 4th dynasty. What exists is a compelling visual parallel, but not an unambiguous case. The debate illustrates how easily evidence slides between measurable fact and symbolic interpretation. Even without invoking Orion, the pyramid's relationship to the sky is evident. The shafts leading from the king's and queen's chambers point not randomly, but in directions that correspond, at least approximately, to prominent stars and constellations of the era. Some scholars suggest that these were symbolic pathways, guiding the king's soul toward the imperishable stars, the circumpolar constellations that never set. Others caution that the alignments are imprecise and could reflect practical considerations rather than ritual ones. The shafts end in blocking stones, and their function, ventilation, symbolism, or both, remains uncertain. The data show real alignments. The meaning is contested. Solar connections also enter the discussion. The east-west axis of the pyramids, their causeways, and their associated temples are thought to reflect solar theology, particularly the daily cycle of the sun god Ra. Some archaeologists propose that the causeways were oriented to key points on the horizon where the sun rose or set on significant dates. Such interpretations fit with the rise of the solar cult during the Old Kingdom, yet the lack of explicit inscriptions tying specific architectural choices to solar events leaves the picture incomplete. What survives are orientations, measurements and alignments, clues in stone, but not the builder's explanations. All this precision sets Giza apart from most contemporary building traditions. Other ancient structures show impressive feats of engineering, but few display such consistent orientation across multiple monuments. The Egyptians were not alone in observing the sky, but they appear to have made its order an integral part of their most ambitious projects. This suggests a worldview in which cosmic stability was inseparable from royal power. By aligning their monuments with the heavens, the kings embedded themselves within a larger order, one that transcended their mortal reigns. Yet certainty slips away at the very moment it seems strongest. The measurements are solid, the orientation to north, the correlation of shafts, the careful placement of causeways, but the reasons remain open. Were these astronomical markers, symbolic gestures, or pragmatic surveying techniques? Scholars can reconstruct methods, but not motives. The pyramids align with the sky, but the meaning of that alignment is still written in the language of debate. From this celestial vantage, the focus bends back to Earth. If the pyramids were meant as tombs, symbols, or both, the question arises, what function did their interiors truly serve? For in spite of their scale and apparent purpose, the pyramids' chambers have yielded little of what you would expect from a royal burial. Empty sarcophagi, missing mummies, and absent treasures open the next frontier of mystery. Whether these monuments fulfilled their function as tombs at all, or whether something more complex is concealed within their silence. When the pyramids are spoken of, they are usually introduced as tombs. That label has persisted for centuries, and in many ways it is logical. They are funerary monuments, part of vast necropolises, surrounded by temples, mastabas, and subsidiary burials. But when you step inside the great structures themselves, something strange becomes immediately apparent. The expected markers of a royal burial, mummy, coffin, treasures, funerary texts, are absent. What remains is the architecture alone, stripped of the items that usually define a tomb. This absence has fueled debates that reach from mainstream scholarship to speculative theories, because the pyramids seem at once self-evidently funerary, and yet curiously silent about the burials they supposedly protected. Egyptian texts from the Old Kingdom and later emphasize the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife. By the 5th and 6th dynasties, the so-called pyramid texts were inscribed on the walls of smaller pyramids, containing spells to guide the king's soul to the stars. These texts describe the king's ascent, his identification with Osiris, and his transformation into an eternal being. The pyramid in this context is not just a tomb, but a cosmic machine, a vehicle of resurrection. Even if Khufu's own pyramid does not bear inscriptions, the ideology that surrounded it is consistent. The pyramid form embodies the Benben, the primordial mound of creation, and its sloping sides channel the king toward the sky. In this sense, the function as a resurrection monument is verified by the cultural record. Yet against this ideological clarity stands the archaeological void. No royal mummy has ever been found within the pyramids of Giza. The granite sarcophagus in Khufu's chamber was empty when first opened, with no traces of a body or treasures. The same is true of Khafre's and Menkare's pyramids. Looting is the standard explanation. In antiquity, tomb robbers stripped burials of valuables and removed bodies, but some scholars argue that looting alone cannot account for the absolute emptiness, the absence not only of treasures, but of any remains. Were the bodies buried elsewhere, with the pyramids serving as cenotaphs rather than tombs? The debate remains unsettled, with Egyptologists divided between pragmatic robbery explanations and more complex ritual interpretations. Adding to the controversy are modern theories that suggest the pyramids may have served additional functions beyond burial. Some propose that they were symbols of cosmic order, designed to manifest the pharaoh's divine status, rather than to house his body. Others go further, speculating about functions as power plants or energy devices, ideas that lack support in mainstream archaeology but persist in popular imagination. Historians emphasize that such fringe claims ignore the overwhelming funerary context of the necropolis. The pyramids stood at the center of mortuary complexes, with temples and causeways clearly tied to rituals of death and rebirth. To call them anything but funerary is to sever them from the cultural fabric of which they were a part. Still, the empty chambers give enough ambiguity for speculation to thrive. One middle position, considered seriously by some scholars, is that the Great Pyramids functioned as cenotaphs, monuments, symbolizing the king's eternal presence, while the actual burial may have occurred elsewhere, perhaps in hidden tombs now lost. This would explain why no mummy has been recovered, while still acknowledging the religious role of the pyramid as a resurrection engine. It also aligns with the fact that subsidiary burials and boat pits surround the pyramids, reinforcing their symbolic role in preparing the king for eternity. The pyramid's form itself may contain the answer. The shape echoes the Benben stone of Heliopolis, the sacred symbol of the first creation, and by extension it embodies solar theology. The pyramid becomes both tomb and cosmological statement, simultaneously protecting the king's remains and broadcasting his identification with the sun's eternal cycle. To the Egyptians of the 4th dynasty, these were not contradictory roles. A tomb was never merely a grave, it was a portal into a cosmic narrative. From that perspective, the pyramids' silence about their occupants is less surprising. The stone structure itself was the guarantee of immortality, whether or not the body remained intact within. Still, the archaeological silence cannot be ignored. Visitors stand inside chambers, expecting to see at least traces of burial, but they confront only stone. This emptiness complicates the tidy definition of pyramid as tomb. It forces historians to wrestle with a duality. The cultural texts confirm funerary purpose, but the physical evidence refuses to cooperate. In that tension lies the enduring mystery, an object that is both unquestionably a tomb and yet strangely not. And it is here that the puzzle deepens. For if these were indeed tombs, why are their sarcophagi empty? Why are there no funerary goods in situ? No inscriptions in the main chambers? No obvious traces of occupation? Was it looting, cenotaphic symbolism, or something more complex? This unresolved gap pushes the investigation forward. To probe it, you must look closer at the sarcophagi themselves, the empty spaces and the physical absences that echo louder than any inscription. Inside the king's chamber of Khufu's pyramid stands a massive granite box that archaeologists call a sarcophagus. Its walls are thick, its lid long gone, its interior empty. When explorers first documented it in the early modern period, there were no bones, no wrappings, no treasures. The emptiness was not unique. In the second pyramid attributed to Khafre, another stone container was found without remains. In Menkaura's pyramid, yet another burial chamber yielded fragments, but even there the hoped-for royal body was absent. The pattern is consistent: 3 pyramids, 3 sarcophagi, no pharaohs. Looting explains part of this silence. Records from later dynasties already complain of tomb robbery. Ancient thieves were efficient, motivated not by curiosity but by treasure. Gold, precious stones and valuables were their aim, and in the process they disturbed or removed the bodies themselves. By the time modern archaeologists entered Giza's pyramids, millennia of opportunistic intrusions had already stripped them bare. This explanation is persuasive but not complete, for even when grave robbers plundered other tombs, they often left behind traces, broken jars, fragments of linen, scraps of bones. At Giza, the emptiness feels more absolute, as if nothing was ever there in the first place. That unresolved absence keeps debate alive. One complication arises from the condition of the sarcophagus in Khufu's chamber. Its dimensions are larger than the passage leading into the chamber. meaning it must have been placed before the chamber was sealed. This indicates that the chamber was designed for it from the start, not added later. The fact that such effort was made to install it supports the idea of an intended burial, yet the absence of contents leaves open the possibility that the chamber was never used for its final purpose, or that the burial was relocated. Another question lies in the missing sealing devices. Scholars note that some blocking stones in passages do not match what would be expected if the chambers had been sealed against intrusion. Either they were broken open in antiquity, or they were never fully installed. In either case, the integrity of the burial sequence is disrupted, making it difficult to reconstruct what originally happened. Egyptologists who lean toward the cenotaph theory point to these gaps as evidence that the pyramids were symbolic monuments, rather than actual graves. But others argue that looters in the first intermediate period, or earlier, could easily have dismantled the sealing stones, leaving behind little trace of their intrusion. The contrast between the empty pyramids and the surrounding cemeteries sharpens the puzzle. Mastabas, near the pyramids, contain intact burials, complete with mummies, coffins, and grave goods. Officials who served the kings were buried with care and ritual detail, and their remains survive to this day. The fact that lesser elites have left us more physical evidence of their burials than the pharaohs themselves is striking. It may reflect the greater vulnerability of royal tombs to looting. Precisely because they promised greater wealth, they were targeted earlier and more thoroughly. Or it may hint at a different conception of royal burial, one in which the pyramid itself sufficed as eternal monument, while the body's resting place was less critical. These questions return inevitably to the emptiness of Khufu's sarcophagus. The bare granite box is simultaneously proof of planning and evidence of absence. Its weight and precision suggest purpose. Its void interior resists closure. Archaeologists often point out that absence is not evidence of a different function. The pyramid was still a funerary monument by cultural context, but the silence continues to disturb. Each visitor who peers into the hollow stone feels the same paradox. Here is a container built to guard eternity, but eternity has slipped away. The silence extends further. If looters took the king's remains, why did they leave the sarcophagus itself? Granite was valuable, yet it was not broken or carted off. If the pyramid was never used for burial, why construct so elaborate a chamber at all? Each explanation answers one part of the puzzle, but leaves another fragment unsolved. Egyptology accepts uncertainty here. There may never be a definitive resolution, only competing probabilities. And this is what carries you forward. The sarcophagi are empty, the mummies gone, the burial goods absent, but the pyramids themselves are not void. They still preserve the traces of tools, of materials, of methods that explain how stone was shaped and fitted with such precision. When the question of who lies within fails to yield an answer, attention shifts to the instruments that made the monuments possible. From empty chambers you move to the tools in the hands of the builders, the copper, dolerite, and abrasives that cut through granite and limestone to give form to the greatest stones ever raised. The pyramids are mute, but the tools that shaped them still speak in the marks they left behind. When you look closely at the stones, at the cuts, grooves, and surfaces, you begin to see the fingerprints of ancient technology. It is here that the contrast sharpens. The monuments appear almost impossibly perfect at a distance, yet under scrutiny they reveal the traces of simple instruments wielded with persistence and skill. Archaeologists excavating the granite quarries at Aswan uncovered hundreds of pounders made of dolerite, a hard igneous stone. These spherical tools were used to strike the granite repeatedly, loosening flakes until a block was freed. The quarry at Aswan still bears unfinished pieces, including a colossal obelisk left in situ, its sides scarred by countless blows. The evidence is unambiguous. With nothing more than dolerite hammers, the Egyptians could extract granite. It was a process of brute endurance rather than refined mechanics, but it worked. The pounders themselves are worn smooth, testifying to hours of human effort concentrated into each groove. Yet granite was not only quarried, it was also shaped and fitted into architectural elements, from massive beams to precision-carved sarcophagi. Copper chisels were part of this toolkit, though copper is far softer than granite. To compensate, the Egyptians combined copper tools with abrasive materials, particularly sand containing quartz. Experiments have shown that by pouring sand into a groove and sawing with a copper blade, granite can be cut slowly but effectively. This technique leaves telltale striations, and such marks are visible on cores and blocks from Old Kingdom sites. What seems improbable at first glance, the shaping of the hardest stones with soft metal, becomes plausible when you account for the abrasive role of sand. Perhaps the most remarkable traces are the spiral grooves on the cylindrical cores, extracted from drilled holes. These grooves suggest the use of tubular drills, probably copper tubes, charged with abrasive slurry. The holes are narrow, deep, and remarkably straight. Egyptologists interpret them as evidence of sustained, controlled drilling, not of advanced machinery. Critics sometimes argue that the precision is too great for ancient tools, but replications show that, given time and manpower, tubular drilling with sand abrasives can indeed achieve these results. What is extraordinary is not the technology itself, but the scale of its application. Thousands of drill holes, cut stones, and sawed surfaces across monumental projects. The absence of iron in the 4th dynasty adds another layer of difficulty. Iron tools would have made the work far easier, but evidence suggests that large-scale use of iron in Egypt did not come until much later. Instead, copper dominated, supplemented by stone tools and abrasives. This constraint underscores the ingenuity of the builders. They were not magicians. They were craftsmen, adapting to the materials available. Where copper dulled quickly, they recast it. Where dolerite cracked, they selected another pounder. The sheer quantity of tools required must have been enormous, with workshops producing and recycling equipment constantly throughout the construction process. What emerges is a portrait of persistence. Each block, each groove, each polished surface embodies hours of repetitive effort. The grandeur of the pyramid is built not on lost technologies, but on the relentless application of simple ones. This recognition does not diminish the achievement, it amplifies it. Knowing that copper, sand, and stone sufficed to create monuments that still dominate the horizon forces you to reassess human capability. And yet the paradox remains, if the tools were so rudimentary, how did the builders achieve such precision? The joints between casing stones in Khufu's pyramid are so tight that even a blade cannot be slipped between them. The sarcophagus in the king's chamber is square to within fractions of a degree. Experiments replicate the processes, but rarely the speed. To raise a pyramid in a few decades, with these methods still seems daunting. Scholars acknowledge that the tools are known, the marks are visible, the techniques are replicable, but the scale and efficiency of their application remain less clear. This tension leads naturally to the next field of inquiry. The stones may have been cut with copper and sand, but once cut they had to be dressed, joined, and finished. Mortars and casings, polishing and alignment. These elements reveal a second layer of craftsmanship, one in which the surface of the pyramid was transformed into a gleaming white mountain, reflecting sunlight across the Nile Valley. From the tools that shaped the core, you move to the materials that clothed the pyramid, the delicate details of casing stones, plaster, and the vanished pyramion that once crowned the summit. When the pyramids stood complete, they looked nothing like the weathered, stepped cores you see today. What is missing is the outer skin, the smooth white casing that once gave the monuments their brilliance. Archaeologists have recovered fragments of this casing stone, and ancient accounts describe the pyramids gleaming in the sun, visible from many miles away. The builders achieved this effect by using fine limestone from Tura, a quarry across the Nile. This stone was denser, more uniform, and lighter in color than the local Giza limestone, and when polished, it produced a dazzling sheen. The pyramids would have appeared not as rough stacks of blocks, but as radiant mountains, symbolically linking the pharaoh with the blinding power of the sun. Much of this outer casing is gone, stripped in later centuries, for use in medieval Cairo's mosques and fortresses. Historical records confirm that earthquakes dislodged casing stones, which were then quarried as ready-made building material. By the time early explorers described the pyramids, only patches remained. Some of the best preserved casing blocks survive at the base of Khafre's pyramid, still showing the precise fit and smooth surface that once covered all four sides. These surviving stones are enough to demonstrate the incredible craftsmanship. Joints are so fine that they appear seamless, the blocks angled to lock into place with both precision and durability. The mortar that held these stones together is another subject of study. Analyses show a composition of gypsum and lime with traces of silica, a mixture that set hard and has lasted thousands of years. In some cases, the mortar is stronger than the limestone itself. This detail is often overlooked, but it was crucial. Without a reliable binding agent, the casing stones could not have achieved their stability. Samples from different parts of the pyramid reveal slight variations, suggesting that the recipes were adapted for specific purposes. The builders were not only moving stone, they were experimenting with chemistry, ensuring that the outer surface endured. The loss of the casing stones has another consequence. It changes the pyramid's appearance in ways that affect our perception of the whole. What you see today is the rough inner core, a structure designed to be hidden, not displayed. The original aesthetic was entirely different. Smooth, angled, gleaming white, crowned at the top with a pyramidion likely made of granite or even gilded to reflect sunlight. Ancient sources describe pyramidia, the capstones that symbolize the Benben stone of creation. No intact pyramidion from Giza has been found, but examples from other sites confirm their existence. Whether Khufu's was granite, basalt, or metal-plated is unknown, but its symbolic role as the final point of contact between heaven and earth is undisputed. The restoration of these features in your imagination transforms the pyramids. Instead of weathered giants, eroded by time, picture three luminous monuments rising from the desert, their surfaces reflecting the midday sun, their capstones catching the first light of dawn. This was not accidental, but deliberate. The builders were embedding solar theology into stone, ensuring that the king's eternal house was not dark and hidden, but radiant and cosmic. The pyramid, in this sense, was not only a tomb, but a mirror of the sun itself. What remains uncertain is how these casing stones were finished and set. Some show evidence of being dressed in place, trimmed and polished after installation to achieve a perfect surface. Others may have been shaped at the quarry and then fitted together like pieces of a colossal puzzle. The methods remain debated, but the outcome is clear. The casing transformed the pyramid from a construction project into a theological statement, from mere architecture into cosmic symbol. The pyramidion itself, though absent, serves as a metaphor for what is lost. It would have been the crowning piece, the literal tip of the monument. Yet it is gone, perhaps shattered in antiquity or taken for reuse. Its disappearance mirrors the larger story of the pyramids. What survives are the bones of the monuments, stripped of their skin, leaving you to reconstruct the brilliance from fragments and texts. From here, the investigation turns toward what the pyramids themselves say, or rather, what they do not say. For in later dynasties, walls were inscribed with spells and hymns. But in the Great Pyramids of Giza, the silence continues. To understand their function, scholars must turn to the pyramid texts of later rulers, reading backward into the silence of Khufu and Khafre. In those inscriptions, the cosmic function of the pyramid comes into focus, connecting architecture, theology, and celestial order. The absence of inscriptions inside the Great Pyramids of Giza is striking. Their walls are silent, smooth, and undecorated, offering no written explanation of purpose. But later pyramids break this silence, and in doing so, they provide a key. By the 5th and 6th dynasties, beginning with the Pyramid of Unas at Saqqara, Hieroglyphic inscriptions, known as the pyramid texts, were carved into the walls of burial chambers. These are the oldest extensive religious writings known, and they cast light backward on the meaning of the earlier uninscribed monuments. The text described the king's transformation after death, his ascension to the sky, and his identification with deities. They speak of the pharaoh joining the imperishable stars that circle the north, of sailing with the sun god Ra across the heavens, and of merging with Osiris, lord of the underworld. The language is vivid and poetic. The king flies up like a falcon, climbs on the rays of the sun, and sits among the gods. Inscriptions like these confirm that the pyramid was never a mere grave. It was a vehicle of resurrection, a machine designed to ensure the eternal survival of the king's spirit. What is significant is that the Giza pyramids, built earlier, contain none of these texts. Their chambers remain bare. Egyptologists debate the reason. One view holds that the absence reflects a change in religious practice. In the 4th dynasty, the rituals were carried out verbally by priests and did not require inscription, whereas in later dynasties the words were carved to ensure permanence. Another view suggests that the silence itself was meaningful, a deliberate decision to conceal sacred words. Either way, the absence in Giza and the presence later point to a transition in how Egyptians materialized their theology. The cosmological role of the pyramid is reinforced by its alignment with the Heliopolitan solar cult, the Benben stone of Heliopolis, a sacred symbol of the primeval mound from which the sun first rose, is echoed in the pyramid's shape. The sloping sides channel the king upward, just as the sun ascends the horizon. The pyramid texts explicitly link the king with the sun god, describing him as reborn each day like the solar orb. Archaeological evidence ties the 4th dynasty kings closely to Heliopolis, suggesting that their monuments were part of a deliberate theological program. The pyramid, in this reading, is not only a tomb but a cosmic diagram, a link between the earth of Egypt and the sky of the gods. Even the mysterious shafts in Khufu's pyramid take on meaning in this context. While some argue they were ventilation, others see them as symbolic corridors for the king's soul, their orientation toward circumpolar stars, and Orion aligns with passages in the pyramid texts about the king ascending to the imperishable stars or joining Osiris. The shafts thus may embody in architecture what later texts put into words. Though uninscribed, the pyramid still speaks through stone. Yet ambiguity persists. Were these texts retroactive, reflecting religious developments after Giza's time, or do they preserve ideas already present but unrecorded in Khufu's day? Egyptologists differ. Some argue for continuity. The beliefs were always there, only later inscribed. Others emphasize innovation, that the texts mark a new stage, reflecting shifts in theology and ritual. The debate highlights how the pyramid sits at the boundary between archaeology and belief. Stones provide physical evidence, but meaning resides in texts, and when texts are absent, interpretation is fragile. Nevertheless, the pyramid texts anchor the pyramids firmly within a cosmological framework. They confirm that these monuments were intended not only to house a body, but to transform a king into a divine being. The architecture was both practical and symbolic, the chambers stages in a ritual journey, the whole structure a cosmic ladder. This understanding redefines the pyramids. Their function was as much about metaphysics as about mortuary practice. And this insight carries you outward, back to the desert around Giza. If the pyramid was a cosmic vessel, its setting was not incidental. The surrounding temples, causeways, and boat pits show that the pyramid was part of a larger ritual landscape. The king did not ascend to the stars alone. He was carried in processions, honored in temples, and linked symbolically to the waters of the Nile. The next mystery lies in those surrounding structures, where wooden boats were buried, harbors constructed, and long causeways joined desert to river. Together, they expand the pyramid from a single building into a sacred topography, a network that tied the king's eternal voyage to both sky and water. The pyramid on its own is vast, but it was never meant to stand isolated. Each of the great monuments at Giza formed the centerpiece of a larger complex, and within these complexes were features that extend the mystery outward into the desert and toward the river. Among the most intriguing are the boat pits and harbour installations, reminders that the pharaoh's eternal journey was imagined not only in stone but also in wood and water. Beside the Great Pyramid, archaeologists uncovered long, narrow trenches cut into the rock, some more than 30 meters in length. These were not ordinary construction features, but boat pits sealed with stone slabs. Inside two of them, preserved in thousands of disassembled pieces, lay wooden ships built from cedar planks imported from Lebanon. One of these, painstakingly reconstructed in the 20th century, became known as the Khufu ship. Over 40 meters long, with steering oars and a cabin, it was a vessel capable of real navigation. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the joints tight, the wood still aromatic after millennia. Its preservation is one of the most extraordinary finds in Egyptology, giving you a tangible link to the world that built the pyramids. The purpose of these buried ships is debated. Some scholars see them as solar boats, designed to carry the king across the heavens, alongside the sun god Ra. Others interpret them as funerary craft, meant to transport the king's body in procession from Memphis or across the Nile. Still others argue that they were ritual vehicles, symbolic rather than practical, sealed away to accompany the king in the afterlife. Whatever their exact function, their presence emphasizes that water and journey were integral to the pyramid's meaning. A pyramid was not simply a house of stone, it was a point of departure, and boats were the means of travel beyond. The causeways reinforce this sense of movement. Each pyramid was connected to the Nile floodplain by a monumental causeway, often hundreds of meters long, paved and sometimes decorated with reliefs. These causeways linked the valley temples near the river to the mortuary temples at the pyramid's base. Through them, processions carried offerings, priests, and perhaps the body of the king. The causeways were not only practical corridors, but ritual avenues, binding river to desert, life to death, and earth to sky. Their alignment often points toward significant solar events, strengthening the link between cosmic cycles and royal ritual. Harbour remains near Giza further complete the picture. Sediment studies suggest that a branch of the Nile once reached close to the plateau, forming a basin or port where boats could dock. This harbour would have been essential for transporting the massive limestone blocks from Tura and granite from Aswan, as described in the diary of Mera. It also provided the setting for ritual landings, where boats carrying the king or sacred objects could disembark before ascending the causeways. In this way, the pyramid complex was anchored not only in the desert, but in the dynamic landscape of the river. Taken together, the boat pits, ships, causeways, and harbours show that the pyramid was never conceived in isolation. It was part of a choreography of stone and water, of desert plateau and Nile current, of earthly journey and celestial voyage. The burial of real ships alongside the pyramid confirms that the Egyptians imagined the king's afterlife not as static rest, but as eternal movement. The reconstructed Khufu ship still floats in your imagination, a wooden vessel sealed for thousands of years, intended to carry a king where no human had gone before. Yet even here, mysteries remain. Why were some boat pits filled with vessels and others left empty? Was there a distinction between solar and funerary boats, or were they one and the same? Did these ships ever sail before burial, or were they built solely to be interred? The lack of inscriptions leaves these questions open. Archaeologists can reconstruct the planks, but not the exact voyage they were meant to make. This ambiguity prepares the ground for the next theme, for if the pyramid complex embodied eternal journeys through boats and causeways, its chronology must also be secured in time. But here too, certainty falters. The dating of the pyramids, though broadly accepted in the mid-3rd millennium BCE, is riddled with small discrepancies. Radiocarbon samples, king lists, and astronomical models sometimes yield conflicting results. The next step in the inquiry is to confront these chronological puzzles, where the attempt to pin down exact years becomes as elusive as the missing pharaohs themselves. Chronology is supposed to provide certainty. In Egyptian history, king lists, monuments, and inscriptions give a backbone of dynasties and reigns. Yet when it comes to the pyramids, the timeline is not quite as seamless as you might expect. The consensus places the construction of Khufu's pyramid around 2600–2500 BCE within the 4th dynasty, but beneath that surface agreement lie tensions between textual sources, radiocarbon samples, and archaeological contexts. The result is a chronology that looks firm from a distance but wavers under close inspection. Egyptian scribes of later periods preserved king lists, such as those inscribed at Abydos and Saqqara. These lists provided names of rulers and rough sequences, but they were not neutral documents. They served ritual and political purposes, sometimes omitting kings whose reigns were considered illegitimate. Manetho, a priest writing in the 3rd century BCE, compiled a history of Egypt that has come down through fragments and later citations. His chronology assigns lengths of reigns to the 4th dynasty kings, but reconciling his numbers with the archaeological record is not always straightforward. In particular, the reign length of Khufu varies depending on which source you consult. 23 years in one account, over 60 in another. The pyramid itself seems too vast to have been completed in the shorter span, raising questions about whether Manetho's figures are accurate or symbolic. Radiocarbon dating offers an independent check, but it has brought its own complications. Samples taken from organic material, charcoal, reeds, and mortar inclusions within the pyramid complex have sometimes yielded dates that are slightly older than expected by a few centuries. One interpretation is that the materials were recycled. Builders may have burned wood that was already centuries old, skewing the results. Another possibility is that the calibration of early radiocarbon studies was imprecise, and later refinements bring the dates closer to the expected window. Even so, the variation highlights how fragile the timeline can be. A single charcoal fragment can shift debates by hundreds of years, leaving scholars cautious about overconfidence. Archaeologists also point to evidence of reuse and repair that complicates dating. Some casing stones appear to have been reinstalled in antiquity, and restoration inscriptions from later dynasties record repairs to older monuments. These interventions blur the boundary between original construction and later maintenance. When a block is dated by its organic inclusions, is it recording the time of the initial build or of a later repair? The distinction is critical, but often impossible to determine with certainty. Despite these challenges, the broad placement of the pyramids in the mid-3rd millennium BCE remains solid. The surrounding cemeteries, with their inscribed tombs of officials, link the monuments securely to the 4th dynasty kings. Titles and reliefs refer to service in the pyramid cults of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, anchoring the structures in their historical moment. The discrepancies are real but limited. The pyramids were not built thousands of years earlier, as some speculative theories propose. The radiocarbon anomalies may shift the chronology by decades or centuries, but they do not overturn the dynastic context. What emerges, then, is a nuanced picture. The pyramids stand firmly in the Old Kingdom, yet the exact reign lengths, construction durations, and dating of specific phases remain debated. The question is not were they 4th dynasty, but how do we pin down the details within that dynasty? This distinction matters because it shapes how you interpret the logistics. A reign of 23 years implies a construction speed that seems almost superhuman. A reign of 60 years makes the feat more plausible. The truth may lie somewhere in between, but without definitive evidence, the debate endures. This uncertainty reflects a larger theme. The pyramids embody both monumental clarity and historical ambiguity. You can stand in front of Khufu's pyramid and know you are seeing the work of the 4th dynasty, but ask how many years it took, whether the king lived to see its completion, or whether the radiocarbon dates reflect original construction or later repairs, and the answers dissolve into probabilities. The stones are certain, the timeline less so. And from here the mystery circles back to what the pyramids themselves record. Inscriptions on blocks, graffiti by work crews, and seals provide some of the only contemporary voices linking the pyramids to their builders. But even there, silence dominates. There are markings, yes, but no master plan, no narrative carved into stone. It is this mix of evidence and absence, the names scribbled by workers, the lack of a builder's chronicle, that defines the next chapter of inquiry. Among the most curious features of the Giza pyramids is not what is found inside them, but what is missing from their walls. Other great monuments of Egypt are covered with inscriptions, hieroglyphs carved on temple pylons, reliefs in tombs, lists of offerings, and scenes of ritual. At Giza, the grandest works of all remain virtually silent. Instead of a running record of who built them and how, you find only fragments, workmen's graffiti, marks of transport, occasional seals. This silence is not merely absence. It is a puzzle that forces you to ask why the greatest monuments of Egypt offer so few words about themselves. The graffiti discovered in the relieving chambers above Khufu's burial chamber are among the most significant pieces of evidence linking the pyramid directly to his reign. These red ochre markings record the names of work gangs, such as the Friends of Khufu, and sometimes include brief dedications to the king. They are casual, almost like construction notes, not ceremonial inscriptions. Their presence makes clear that the pyramid was indeed built during Khufu's reign, by named teams who took pride in their work. Without these scrawls, the attribution of the pyramid might be more contested, but with them the connection is undeniable. Beyond these graffiti, however, the silence deepens. There is no long inscription detailing the pyramid's construction, no carved text describing the methods used, no hieroglyphic record of the king commissioning the project. For a civilization so verbose in stone, this absence is striking. Egyptologists debate the reason. Some suggest that the construction was so sacred, so bound up with royal and cosmic mysteries, that it was deliberately left unrecorded. Others believe that the practical details were never meant for posterity. They belonged to the oral tradition of the workforce and administration, not to the eternal language of ritual. In either case, the effect is the same. You are left with the stones themselves as the only enduring record of their making. Seals and marks on blocks supplement the graffiti, but offer little narrative. Some blocks bear the names of quarries or inspectors, confirming logistics, but not storytelling. At mastabas surrounding the pyramids, inscriptions detail officials' careers, including titles such as Overseer of the Pyramid of Khufu. These references anchor the pyramids firmly in the bureaucratic framework of the Old Kingdom. They show that pyramid construction was not a one-time event, but the foundation of a lasting cult, sustained by priests and administrators across generations. Still, these inscriptions talk about roles and offices, not the engineering steps of construction. The lack of a construction chronicle has fueled alternative theories. Fringe writers claim that the silence must mean the pyramids predate the Egyptians themselves, built by some lost civilization. Egyptologists counter that such claims ignore the overwhelming weight of contextual evidence, the cemeteries, the graffiti, the administrative titles. The silence is real, but it is not evidence of alien origins. It is a cultural choice or an accident of preservation. The Egyptians did not carve their blueprints in stone. Instead, they left hints scattered in workmen's marks and in the surrounding necropolis. What makes this silence more enigmatic is the contrast with smaller pyramids and later structures. In 5th and 6th dynasty pyramids, inscriptions abound, especially the pyramid texts. The absence at Giza is therefore not due to general practice, but to a particular moment in time. Perhaps the ideology of the 4th dynasty emphasized the king's transcendence, his identity with the sun, more than the mechanics of construction. To inscribe methods and labor might have seemed beneath the dignity of the divine house. Or perhaps the focus was on the external cult temples, causeways, rituals, rather than on the internal chambers. Whatever the case, the pyramids of Giza remain architectural testimonies without accompanying words. Yet even silence speaks. The graffiti of the workers, though brief, humanize the enterprise. They show that the pyramid was not the work of faceless slaves, but of organized teams with names, identities, and pride. The absence of official inscriptions, meanwhile, emphasizes the mystery, forcing modern observers to reconstruct the story from fragments. This interplay of marks and silences defines the pyramid as both evidence and enigma. And from this paradox emerges the next path. If words are scarce, perhaps materials can speak in their place. The mortar that bound the stones, the microscopic traces in the limestone, the chemical composition of the plaster, these provide another form of testimony where inscriptions fall silent. The science of materials begins to whisper answers, offering a different perspective on how the pyramids were built and why their structure endures. If the walls of the pyramids are silent, the stones themselves are not. They carry within their surfaces and seams the microscopic traces of how they were cut, joined, and stabilized. Modern science has turned to these materials for answers, and what has emerged is a picture of technical sophistication hidden within what looks, from a distance, like brute simplicity. The pyramids are more than stacked blocks. They are bonded by carefully chosen mortars, reinforced by knowledge of stone properties, and marked by pigments that reveal processes invisible to the naked eye. One of the most intriguing discoveries lies in the mortar used between blocks. Analyses of samples taken from Khufu's pyramid show that the mixture contains gypsum, lime, and silicate particles. Under a microscope, the mortar reveals a crystalline structure that has allowed it to endure for thousands of years, often harder than the stone it binds. This detail may seem small, but it mattered immensely. Without a binding agent capable of setting hard and resisting erosion, the casing stones could not have fit so seamlessly, nor the core held together under the immense weight of millions of tons of limestone. The builders were not only cutting stone, they were also experimenting with materials chemistry, ensuring that their monument outlasted them. The limestone itself carries its own testimony. Geological studies show that the local stone of the Giza Plateau contains layers of varying hardness. Quarrymen exploited this knowledge, selecting softer beds for core blocks and harder layers for surfaces. In some areas, they left behind fossilized shells embedded in the limestone, which still protrude from unfinished blocks. These fossils provide not only geological context, but also a reminder that each stone is unique, chosen, and placed with awareness of its properties. The pyramid, then, is not a uniform pile, but a carefully curated assembly of different strata, each with its role. Granite from Aswan presents another case. This stone is composed of quartz and feldspar, minerals that make it exceptionally hard. The beams above the king's chamber weigh more than 50 tons each. Their transport and placement astonishing feats, but beyond the engineering, their composition matters. Granite resists compression and absorbs stress, which is why it was chosen for areas of high structural demand. The decision to bring granite from hundreds of kilometers away was not arbitrary. It reflects an understanding of its superior properties, knowledge that guided material choices long before geology became a science. Traces of pigment also provide insights. On some blocks, faint markings of red paint appear, often in the form of notations or symbols. These were not decorative but practical, likely used to designate placement, orientation, or crew assignments. They show that the pyramid was not only a feat of muscle, but also of organization. Every block carried meaning in its marks, part of a logistical code, now mostly lost. Even the smallest strokes of pigment testify to the invisible system behind the monument. There is also the question of whether some blocks were reconstituted rather than quarried whole. A minority of researchers have suggested that parts of the pyramid might contain an early form of cast stone, created by pouring a slurry of limestone and binding agents into molds. The hypothesis arises from unusual microstructures observed in certain samples, which differ from natural limestone. While intriguing, this idea remains contested. Most geologists argue that the blocks are natural stone, their variations explained by geological processes rather than artificial casting. The debate, though unresolved, illustrates how even the material itself can generate mystery, forcing science to confront ambiguities in the rock. What becomes clear is that the pyramid is not simply a marvel of size, but also of detail. Each mortar joint, each geological layer, each pigment stroke contributes to the whole. The builders were attentive not only to mass, but to microstructure, combining materials in ways that ensured endurance. When you walk along the base and see eroded blocks, you are seeing the remains of a system that once gleamed with precision and polish, held together by chemical bonds as much as by gravity. And yet, the study of materials also raises new questions. How did the builders discover the optimal mortar recipes? Were they experimenting on smaller projects before applying them here? Did they understand the long-term durability of their mixtures, or did they simply seek immediate strength? These questions remind you that knowledge itself is layered. Some answers are clear, others remain hidden in the microscopic spaces between stones. The pyramid thus becomes a dialogue between geology and human ingenuity. It stands not only because of the labor that raised it, but because of the materials chosen, adapted and bound. In its chemistry, as much as in its architecture, the pyramid reveals a sophistication that compels respect. And from here, attention shifts toward another realm of measurement, not just what the pyramid is made of, but how its dimensions and volumes reveal the scale of the achievement. For beyond the chemistry lies the arithmetic of the Colossus, the sheer logistics of placing millions of stones with precision across decades of labor. Numbers turn the pyramid from a silent monument into a problem you can almost measure in your hands. With more than 2 million blocks, an original height of about 146 meters, and a base length of more than 230 meters per side, Khufu's pyramid alone represents an engineering operation on a scale difficult to grasp even today. The arithmetic of this project is where admiration and doubt often meet. Admiration for what the figures imply, doubt about whether such feats were possible in the time frames usually proposed. Consider the total volume. Estimates place it at around 2.3 million cubic meters of stone, spread over an assumed 20-year construction period. This would mean placing more than 100 blocks every day, without pause, for 2 decades. Some scholars calculate rates of 1 block every 2 or 3 minutes during daylight hours. At first glance, such speed seems impossible, but context complicates the picture. Work was not evenly distributed over the entire 20 years. The seasonal rhythm of the Nile flood brought surges of labor when tens of thousands of farmers were available to haul stone, punctuated by quieter months when only specialists remained on site. This rhythm means that productivity was concentrated into intense bursts rather than steady daily averages. Precision also demands attention. Measurements show that the base of the Great Pyramid deviates from true square by only a few centimeters, and the leveling of the foundation varies less than 2 centimeters across hundreds of meters. This degree of accuracy implies surveying techniques of remarkable sophistication. Builders must have used sighting instruments and leveling devices far beyond simple guesswork. Such precision at massive scale creates a paradox. The tools we know they had, plumb lines, rods, simple sighting tools, seem inadequate for such exact results, yet the results are there in stone. Calculations of workload reveal further puzzles. If each block weighed an average of 2.5 tons, the logistics of moving, raising, and setting them required extraordinary coordination. Scholars estimate that organized teams of 20 or more men were needed to haul each block on sledges. Multiply that by millions, and the pyramid becomes a choreography of human energy on a national scale. The state had to feed, house, and direct this workforce with precision, equal to the stones themselves. That such organization left so few written records is itself part of the mystery. The margins of error are especially telling. Despite the vast numbers involved, the pyramid maintains extraordinary consistency. Deviations are measured in centimeters, not meters. Blocks fit tightly, courses remain level, and the overall slope is maintained with minimal drift. Even where casing stones survive, their joints are nearly invisible, less than a millimeter wide in some cases. This level of accuracy, achieved without steel tools or modern machinery, is one of the reasons the pyramid continues to astonish engineers today. It is not only the volume of work, but the precision of that volume that defines the achievement. Yet for all these calculations, uncertainties persist. Models of labor requirements depend on assumptions about ramp design, hauling speed, and working hours. Change one variable, and the numbers shift dramatically. If ramps were longer and gentler, hauling was slower but steadier. If levers were used for the upper courses, the rate of progress may have fluctuated. Some researchers argue that the workforce estimates are too low, that far more people must have been mobilized. Others contend that efficiency gains make smaller numbers plausible. The debate reflects the difficulty of translating arithmetic into lived reality. The stones are measurable, the human effort behind them is not. These uncertainties lead into broader reflections. The arithmetic of the pyramid underscores how fragile our reconstructions are. We can count blocks, measure angles, and calculate volumes, but we cannot fully model the daily realities of the workforce, the injuries, the pauses, the adjustments. Even so, the sheer consistency of the finished structure proves that whatever the methods they worked, the pyramid is its own proof, a demonstration in stone that the arithmetic of impossibility was somehow made real. And from numbers you move to traces of time's effect. For all the perfection in planning and execution, the pyramids have not remained untouched. Earthquakes, looting, and restorations have scarred and reshaped them. The next stage in the story follows this erosion and repair, showing how natural forces and human interventions have altered the monuments we see today, and how those changes themselves add layers of mystery to the original design. The pyramids we see today are not the same monuments that stood at the end of the 4th dynasty. Time, nature, and human hands have reshaped them. What once gleamed with polished white limestone and sharp edges is now a series of stepped cores, their surfaces rough, their summits truncated. Understanding how this transformation occurred is part of the mystery, because the evidence of damage and repair tells its own story, one layered with earthquakes, looting, and interventions that span millennia. Records from medieval chroniclers speak of earthquakes shaking the Cairo region, toppling casing stones from the Great Pyramid. One particularly destructive quake in the 14th century is often cited as the moment when large quantities of limestone blocks loosened. Once fallen, these blocks became a convenient quarry for builders in the growing city nearby. Mosques, citadels, and fortifications were raised from stone that once reflected the sun from Khufu's pyramid. Tracing the origins of blocks in Cairo's medieval architecture confirms this recycling. The monuments of Giza were not just admired but consumed, their skin peeled away to clothe a new city. This repurposing was not only medieval. Already in pharaonic times, later rulers reused pyramid stones for their own projects. Inscriptions show that New Kingdom pharaohs conducted restoration work at Giza, repairing damage and erecting stelae that proclaimed their reverence for the ancient kings. But reverence and reuse went hand in hand. Some stones were extracted to supply temples, and others were moved for construction closer to the Nile. This duality, veneration, and exploitation defined Egypt's relationship with its ancient monuments throughout history. Closer examination of the pyramids reveals evidence of ancient repairs. Blocks in certain courses differ in size, shape, or finish from their neighbors, suggesting that sections collapsed or eroded and were later rebuilt. In some cases, repair blocks bear inscriptions or quarry marks from later periods, confirming that restorations occurred centuries after the original construction. These repairs, while stabilizing the structure, also obscure the original design. Archaeologists must disentangle what belongs to Khufu or Khafre from what was added by later hands. The pyramids you see today are palimpsests, combining Old Kingdom stonework with interventions from later dynasties and beyond. Modern conservation has added another layer. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Egyptologists and engineers have reinforced foundations, stabilized cracked blocks, and restricted access to fragile passages. Some interventions are discreet, preserving stability without altering appearance. Others, such as the protective shelters over boat pits or the consolidation of masonry around entrances, are visible additions. Each act of preservation is also an act of change, ensuring survival at the cost of authenticity. The pyramids are no longer untouched relics. They are curated monuments, shaped by modern priorities as much as by ancient vision. The scars of human activity are matched by the work of nature. Wind and sand erosion, rain in rare storms, and thermal expansion under the desert sun all leave their mark. The softer limestone layers erode faster, producing the stepped appearance of cores once covered by smooth casing. Salt crystallization from rising groundwater eats into the stone, creating pockmarks and fractures. These natural processes remind you that the pyramids, for all their grandeur, are not eternal in substance, only in cultural endurance. What complicates the picture further is that some damages may themselves have altered interpretation. A collapsed chamber roof, a shifted block, or a lost casing stone can lead archaeologists to misread the original design. When restorers in antiquity replaced blocks, they may have chosen expediency over fidelity, unintentionally distorting details. The result is that the pyramids as we study them are not pristine blueprints of 4th dynasty intent, but monuments shaped by centuries of accident and repair. To reconstruct the original requires not only archaeology but imagination, stripping away layers of later history. And yet these scars tell their own story of resilience. Despite earthquakes, looting, and erosion, the pyramids still stand, their cores unbroken, their forms unmistakable. They have outlasted empires, religions and civilizations, surviving as both ruins and icons. The very fact that they remain recognizable despite such losses is testimony to the strength of their original design. What was stripped, cracked, or shifted could not erase their outline against the desert sky. The cycle of damage and restoration also prepares the ground for the next chapter of inquiry. For if traditional archaeology and historical records show only part of the story, modern science brings new eyes to the pyramids. Using technologies unimagined by their builders, muon detectors, thermal cameras, drones, researchers now peer inside without breaking a single stone. These methods have already revealed anomalies that shake old assumptions, opening a new frontier of mysteries in the 21st century. In the last decade, the pyramids have been subjected to a new kind of exploration, one that does not rely on chisels, torches, or blasting powder, but on physics and data. Technologies developed for particle research, aerospace, and engineering have been adapted to archaeology, allowing scientists to see into the stone without tearing it apart. The result is a wave of discoveries that both confirm the complexity of the structures and open fresh mysteries that echo those faced by the earliest explorers. One of the most significant breakthroughs came from the Scanned Pyramids project, which applied muon radiography to Khufu's pyramid. Cosmic rays strike the Earth constantly, and when they interact with the atmosphere, they produce muons, tiny particles capable of penetrating dense material like stone. By placing detectors around and inside the pyramid, the result announced in 2017 was the detection of a large void above the Grand Gallery, at least 30 meters long. This space, invisible from outside and inaccessible by current passages, was confirmed by multiple independent teams. Its existence is now beyond doubt, yet its purpose remains entirely unknown. Was it a hidden chamber, a structural feature to reduce weight, or a symbolic cavity? No inscription or parallel explains it. What the detectors revealed was not an answer, but a new question. Thermal imaging has added further intrigue. Infrared surveys conducted in 2015 recorded temperature anomalies on the north face of the pyramid. Certain stones warmed or cooled differently than those around them, suggesting cavities or differences in material density beneath the surface. While some anomalies can be explained by variations in stone type or weathering, others hint at hidden architectural features. These findings overlap with the muon data, reinforcing the idea that the pyramid's interior is more complex than the handful of chambers long known to archaeologists. Endoscopic probes have ventured into the narrow shafts that extend from the king's and queen's chambers. In one of these, a small robot camera discovered a blocking stone with copper fittings, a detail that raised more questions than it answered. Were these fittings symbolic, or were they once part of a mechanism to seal the shaft? Beyond that stone lay another cavity, inaccessible without breaching. Each probe reveals a little more, only to confront a new barrier. The shafts, once thought to be simple vents, have become among the most enigmatic features of the pyramid, tantalizing in their refusal to yield full access. Drones and 3D laser scanning have transformed how the pyramids are documented from the outside. High-resolution models capture every block, every crack, every shift in alignment, creating digital versions that can be studied remotely. These models reveal subtle patterns invisible to the naked eye, such as shifts in block size across different courses, or micro-deviations in slope that may reflect phases of construction. While they do not answer the deepest mysteries, they allow for precision analysis and comparisons never before possible. All of these modern tools share a paradoxical effect. They penetrate further into the pyramids than human explorers ever could, yet what they reveal is not resolution, but complication. The Great Void, the copper-fitted doors, the thermal anomalies, all confirm that the pyramid is more intricate than textbooks long suggested. But the meanings remain elusive. Without text to explain them, the data must be interpreted, and interpretation always carries uncertainty. The pyramid, it seems, resists finality, even in the age of physics. Some scholars see in these discoveries the confirmation of long-suspected features, that the pyramid's interior contained voids for structural reasons, or symbolic cavities to mimic celestial pathways. Others warn against over-interpretation, noting that data can be precise, while conclusions are speculative. What is undeniable is that the pyramid remains a living subject of research, not a solved relic. It continues to challenge both archaeologists and physicists, bridging ancient mystery with modern science. This continuity of discovery leads naturally to another set of monuments, the so-called problem pyramids of earlier kings. These structures, collapsed, bent, or red, show the trial and error that preceded Giza. If the Great Pyramid embodies mastery, the bent and red pyramids reveal the experiments, failures, and adjustments that made that mastery possible. To understand Giza fully, you must turn back to these earlier attempts, where ambition and error are written more plainly into the stone. The pyramids of Giza look like the pinnacle of a tradition, but that tradition was not born perfect. Earlier monuments reveal experiments, miscalculations, and corrections that chart the learning process of Old Kingdom architects. These so-called problem pyramids are not failures in the simple sense, but laboratories in stone where techniques were tested and refined before the precision of Khufu's Great Pyramid. Their forms collapsed, bent, or adjusted demonstrate that mastery emerged through trial and error, not sudden brilliance. At Meidum, south of Giza, stands a pyramid that no longer resembles its original self. Today, it looks like a massive tower, surrounded by a mound of rubble, the remains of its outer layers. Archaeological evidence suggests it began as a stepped pyramid, like Djoser's at Saqqara, but was later converted into a true pyramid by filling in the steps with limestone casing. At some point, whether during construction or centuries later, the outer layers collapsed, leaving only the core. This disaster may have been the result of poor bonding between the old and new masonry. Whatever the cause, Meidum demonstrates that the transition from stepped to smooth-sided pyramids was not seamless. It also raises a question: was the collapse already known to the builders, serving as a warning for later projects, or did it happen unexpectedly, altering how successors approached their designs? The bent pyramid at Dashur offers an even clearer example of mid-course correction. Its lower half rises at a steep angle of about 54 degrees, but midway up the slope, the builders abruptly changed to a gentler angle of about 43 degrees, giving the pyramid its distinctive bent profile. Archaeologists interpret this as a response to structural stress. The steep angle proved unstable, threatening collapse, so the builders adjusted to a safer gradient. This change is written into the monument itself, a physical record of engineering adaptation. The pyramid still stands, but its shape is a frozen compromise between ambition and necessity. It illustrates that ancient architects did not possess perfect foresight. They learned by confronting failure in real time. The Red Pyramid, also at Dashur and attributed to Sneferu, seems to embody the lesson learned from the bent pyramid. It rises entirely at the shallower angle of about 43 degrees, producing a stable structure that survives intact. Its reddish limestone gives it its modern name, but its real significance lies in its design. By adopting the safer angle from the outset, builders avoided the instability that marred earlier attempts. The Red Pyramid thus stands as the first successful large-scale true pyramid, paving the way for Khufu's even more ambitious project at Giza. These monuments show a progression from collapse at Meidum to compromise at the bent pyramid to success at the Red Pyramid. They chart a path of experimentation leading to the confidence that produced the Great Pyramid. Yet even here, questions remain. Why did Sneferu embark on so many pyramid projects, 3 massive constructions in a single reign? Was it personal ambition, a drive to outdo predecessors, or a response to failures that demanded correction? Without inscriptions declaring intent, you are left to infer motives from the stones themselves. The problem pyramids also reveal something essential about how knowledge was transmitted. Mistakes were not hidden. They became part of the architectural landscape. Each monument embodied a lesson, visible to later builders who refined techniques accordingly. By the time Khufu commissioned his pyramid, the architects had a repertoire of experiences: what angles were stable, how casing should be bonded, how internal chambers should be supported. Giza was not built in a vacuum. It was the culmination of a century of experiments etched into earlier monuments. And yet, even these earlier pyramids do not yield all their secrets. Was Meidum's collapse sudden or gradual? Was the bent pyramid's change planned midway or forced by crisis? Did Sneferu intend all 3 pyramids as personal tombs, or were some abandoned in favor of others? The answers remain uncertain, and in that uncertainty lies the enduring fascination of these monuments. They are failures that still stand, puzzles that resist tidy resolution. From this chain of experiments, the pyramids at Giza emerge as the perfected form. But perfection is not the end of the mystery. Even with lessons learned, even with geometry mastered, questions still remain unanswered. What was truly intended by hidden chambers, blocked shafts, or the Sphinx beside them? What records did the builders leave that have not survived? To confront these unresolved issues is to face the ultimate reality, that some questions may never be answered, and that the pyramids endure as much for their silence as for their stone. To follow the chain of mysteries through Giza is to move between clarity and silence, evidence and absence. You can point to quarries, graffiti, and papyri that prove how blocks were moved and which king claimed them. You can measure alignments so precise they rival modern surveying. You can even stand inside chambers whose engineering solutions remain among the most sophisticated of antiquity. Yet at every turn, the gaps return. No pharaohs in their sarcophagi, no inscriptions explaining purpose, no definitive record of methods. The pyramids yield enough data to confirm they belong to Egypt's 4th dynasty, but not enough to dissolve the aura of enigma that has clung to them for millennia. This silence feeds modern fascination. Theories flourish where texts do not constrain interpretation. Some remain within scholarly debate, arguments over ramps, levers, or spiral pathways. Others stray into speculation, claims of lost civilizations or technologies. The pyramids themselves invite this spectrum because they are simultaneously undeniable and unexplained. Every block insists that the builders achieved what they set out to do. Every gap in the record invites new stories about how. One enduring question is why the builders left so little explicit testimony. Later kings carved their pyramids with spells, decorated tombs with scenes, and filled burial chambers with goods. At Giza, the silence is profound. Perhaps it was intentional, an expression of divine mystery, leaving the king's house blank so that it could represent pure cosmic order rather than earthly narrative. Or perhaps the details were transmitted orally and perished with the generations that built them. Whatever the case, the absence is as much a fact as the stones themselves, a mystery not of lost evidence, but of evidence that may never have existed. The broader context only sharpens the puzzle. Workmen's villages show that a workforce was housed, fed, and organized with bureaucratic efficiency. Papyrus fragments, like the Diary of Mera, confirm logistical systems for transporting stone. Boat pits preserve ships that symbolized eternal journeys. These pieces form a coherent picture of state-driven monumentality, and yet the most basic expectations of a tomb, the pharaoh's body, the burial goods, are missing. The combination is strange, overwhelming evidence of how the pyramid was built, paired with enduring silence about what lay inside at the end. This is perhaps the most profound lesson. The pyramids are not puzzles, waiting to be solved once and for all. They are monuments whose very nature is to resist final answers. They embody the tension between human achievement and human limitation. Built with tools of copper and stone, they surpass the durability of empires. Studied for centuries, they still withhold their ultimate secrets. Modern science has not ended the mystery, it has extended it. Muon detectors reveal voids no one can enter. Infrared imaging shows thermal anomalies without explanation. Robotic cameras peer into shafts only to find sealed doors behind sealed doors. Each discovery pushes the horizon of knowledge a little further, only to expose new unknowns. The pyramid resists closure, remaining open-ended in its complexity. And so you arrive at the final paradox. The pyramids were created to guarantee immortality, for kings whose bodies are gone, whose names echo faintly in graffiti and king lists. The kings themselves vanished, but their monuments endured, and in that endurance they achieved a different kind of immortality, not through the preservation of flesh, but through the endless fascination of mystery. Every unanswered question keeps them alive in the human imagination, generation after generation. That is why they stand not just as relics of the old kingdom, but as living enigmas. They continue to provoke, to challenge, to inspire wonder and speculation. Their silence is not a void, but a voice, telling you that some human creations are meant to outlast certainty itself. In the end, the pyramids are not only the tombs of kings, but the tombs of explanations, guardians of mysteries that refuse to die.